I had meant to do that right after we did introduction, so thank you for noting that. As a high-level overview, this is where all of the different elements and attachments that are required live within the document library. And additionally, there's some guidance documents that help you look at different types of projects and understand what's required for that type of project. And so we encourage you to really explore the site, to look at the various materials, and to reach out if you have specific questions. The submittal for the application can be done through a variety of different ways. The main way to do it is through this application portal that we have. This is an online portal. You'll create a username and account and then be able to submit your documents. We encourage you to really develop all your materials in other applications and in Word or Google Docs or other tools for collaboration, and not to wait to really build this all in the application portal, but really to copy and paste your responses into the portal once you're ready. The portal is a useful and powerful tool, but it doesn't really allow for the type of collaboration that other software tools do. You can have multiple people logging into the portal, but you run the risk of overwriting previously entered information. Also, if you'd rather submit information and your application through email and just fill out all the documents and then send them to our email, this is the email. We also do have available mail in submission. I should have put the full address here. I realize that it's not, but it is on our website. And that's the 1900 building, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and you can submit even through paper. We also, I should have mentioned, we have and are doing translation of all our materials in, I believe, 6 key languages. And so those are available for people who would prefer those in a language other than English. So why you're all here today is to talk more in detail about budgeting and how to really put together a request, what the different elements are that you need to keep in mind. And so this is the budget table. We'll also be talking about this a little bit more as I hand it off to Darrell and Kanima Associates to walk you through some of this. But there is a budget table that you should open up and take a look at as you're going through the early parts of looking at your application and putting it together. Very notably, there's a few different pieces of the budget table that differ, where for planning grants, there is not a leverage table or what's often known in the philanthropic world as match, or money that is coming from other sources that's being used in the project. And so for small and large grants for projects, that is an element, but for planning grants, it is not. Also, however, and very critically, leverage or match is not required for PCEF projects. So while we do collect that information and it is part of the evaluation, it is not required as an element. And so we're happy to answer more questions about that as we continue. There's a lot of kind of detail in our technical resources and guidance around how you can use funds. We'll cover this a little bit in this budget training in upcoming slides. But we really just want organizations that are applying to be aware of different allowance, what is allowed, and also some limitations of how funding can be used. And so we do encourage you to really think creatively and to not limit yourself too much in how you're approaching this, because one of the key elements of the Portland Clean Energy Fund is that we are here and this program exists to fill gaps, recognizing that past programs haven't really created the equitable outcomes of addressing climate change or being inclusive in the ways that we need. And so we'll go through more of this in upcoming slides. Overall tips before I hand it over is just recognition that overall our approach is not a race to the bottom. It is a race to the top. We're not viewing things through a lowest cost kind of competitive bidding perspective, but more of the total value of what is being delivered by potential applicants, who benefits, and what the work will result in. Additionally, if you're looking at doing construction, include overhead costs like permitting and contingency. And we do recognize that a lot of these projects will require permitting, and we are part of the city. We want to encourage projects that do require permitting to get permits. Additionally, if your project is going to happen over a number of years, and I should have clarified, planning grants are expected to happen within 1 year. Small grants can take place for up to 3 years, and then large grants can take place for up to 5 years. So if you're planning on the multi-year grant, also make sure that you're budgeting enough money within that grant over the entire time frame to allow for the wage requirements and increases year to year. There's also some very specific caps and thresholds that are in our guidance documents, including things like the overall overhead of a project or administrative costs are not to exceed 20%. Guidance that if you're working with a fiscal sponsor on your project where you're not directly applying, that fiscal sponsor is expected not to take any more than 10% of project costs for their administration of those funds, and that there's a combined overhead and fiscal sponsorship cost cap of 25%. Also, one of the key elements of Portland Clean Energy Fund and the program is that there can be, in the clean energy bucket, for instance, improvements that are made to buildings that are for reasons of health or life safety that are not related directly to the energy savings or kind of the climate impact of the project. Those are limited to 30% of the overall construction budget for those projects. Also, another big consideration for how you plan your project and your workflow is that the overall expectation is that these will be issued on a reimbursement basis. So a grant will be awarded, but funds will have to be expended first, and then you'll be reimbursed. However, there is an opportunity that would be negotiated through the grant agreement with successful applicants for partial advance of funding if needed for the project. And so that we do have that flexibility, but it'll be part of the grant agreement process. So that is the basic intro. If you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and then we'll be able to address them as we get into Q&A. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Darrell and Sharad for the real work of developing your budget and how to approach this whole process. So go ahead, Darrell, and let me know when you'd like to advance slides.
Sure, great. Thank you, James. And again, just I don't know if everybody caught our introduction because we were one of the early introductees at the beginning. But again, my name's Darrell Kalika. I'm the managing partner of Kaneem Associates. We are a Native American-owned consulting firm. Our headquarters are in Portland, but we also have an office in Warm Springs, Oregon, which that's where we are currently presenting from today. And so, yeah, so we, work with a lot of different organizations, but I'd like to let Sharad introduce himself as well. Go ahead.
Sharad Yonker, a partner with Kaneem Associates, enrolled with the Coquille Indian tribe, and roughly, I look at maybe around 20 to 30 grant applications a year, in addition to trying to write my own grant applications for projects that we work for our clients. So hopefully will be helpful in you navigating whatever you're trying to accomplish.
So I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of background on kind of our story with regard to what we bring in terms of the information. And again, we're offering this and I appreciate the survey that took place at the beginning, because we kind of had that built in mind that the sort of audience here was a continuum of folks that are going to be embarking on their first time in the journey of grant writing, others that have had some experience with it, and then others that are kind of seasoned. And hopefully that this provides some source of, when I look at a grant, it seems a bit of, it's always different. I think some people referenced that. And then it can be a daunting project as well. So I guess with a little bit of that story, I, by trade, am an attorney. I started working for a small law firm in 2008. And that was just about the time before the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was rolled out by the last administration. And that was my sort of time to cut my teeth on writing grants. I had never written a grant before. And we had a tribal client who had asked, could you help us write a grant? And so we're all attorneys, and this is our first time doing that. And so in my journey to learn how to write a grant, I had approached it from sort of that perspective of, I have to write contracts, and there's a lot of research that goes into building a contract. And so I kind of took that approach to it and then started doing research in terms of just started asking folks that I knew, especially asking friends of mine who had written grants before and were successful at it. And so I spent some time working with them, getting tips and advice on how to approach it. And I don't know if there are any attorneys on this call that went to Lewis and Clark Law School, but I don't know how many times I heard the statement, how do you eat an elephant? Well, they say one bite at a time. And so my, again, introduction to writing grants was to write federal grants to the U.S. Department of Energy and the Department of Health and Human Services. And at the time, the ARA grants were pretty complicated because not only were you having to comply with the agency-specific requirements, but ARA also had their own requirements. So we had sort of two reporting requirements. And so it was incredibly complicated and a lot of information to go through. The funding opportunity announcements were probably like about that thick, and it was just a challenging process. So I felt like if I was going to start with anything, that was probably the best and most complicated undertaking I took in writing grants. Over the years, I've continued to work with different clients. Most of our client portfolio includes tribes in the Northwest and across the country, intertribal organizations, and then other nonprofits. My background in terms of working on grants has ranged from small sort of planning capacity building grants to large sort of complex utility feasibility studies with multiple different project firms and multiple different parties. And then so within that, sort of portfolio has been one, helping work with folks to write the grant, but also in certain instances, planning how we manage the grant. So kind of what we take into this work that we do is in the spirit of the work that we have in working with the folks we do is that sort of our principles in terms of, we have a stewardship obligation. Some of this we're taking is our cultural principles as an Indigenous owned firm. And then in terms of that, we work quite a bit and quite heavily with our clients. We're not one of those that's kind of telling our clients what to do. We work for them. And in terms of that, really working oftentimes we're spending time with the community. I've had to work on a Department of Energy grant where we were doing strategic planning. Oh, we're good, James, yeah. So working on strategic planning, so we had to do some community outreach and engagement. So, really kind of taking the time to work with what we have and the people that are going to be a part of the process. And sometimes it's been small teams, sometimes that's large teams. In terms of the region that we have experience in is here in the Pacific Northwest. We also work with our clients in terms of, how do we promote, how do we tell our story, how do we tell our project stories, and a lot of that engagement. And then, also in terms of that, in thinking about our grants is, oftentimes when we're preparing these, we don't think about the reporting process and how we can tell that story of our successes, our challenges along the way, and so forth. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. So what I think we're hoping to do today is to demystify a bit of the grant writing process. Again, and whether you are new to grant writing or, like I said, you're kind of have some experience and then really seasoned. But I think the interesting component about this either way is that this is a wholly new funding opportunity through PCEF. And so as I was looking at this and preparing my time to spend with you as another person, you know, looking at how would I approach writing this grant, or what would be appropriate for the folks that I work with, I started going through the materials the day that the announcement came out. And that's generally where I start, is taking a look at the links and pages that James just went through with regard to preparing your application, just taking the time to look through those and to begin reading them. And so, and I just want to pause too, if there's any questions, and I'm going, because I sometimes tend to get going and sometimes need to come up for breath. So if you have a question, please pop it in the chat, and then James, you can just let me know if something comes up. So again, so in terms of thinking about that, you know, when you start going through and reading it, that's one component. But you're coming to this PCEF funding opportunity for a reason. And so I think it's really important to think about why it is that you're here. There's a vision, there's a goal, there's something that you have in mind that you or your organization are looking to accomplish. So that's one thing as advice, I would say, is to always keep that in mind. If anything, put it as a sticky note on your computer or somewhere prominent, because once you start going through the materials, it's easy to start finding the intake of information to become somewhat overwhelming and trying to wrap your head around this process. But you're already taking that step by participating in this webinar today. So as you start to, you know, prepare to apply, and you're going through the materials that are there, there's a point where you're going to start to get to, you know, I'm making this commitment to prepare this application. I'd say one of the things that you can take for granted right off the bat is getting, you know, your documents ready. There's some easy stuff you can do right off the bat that I suggest you do sooner than later, which is, you know, things like for your organization, have your mission statement ready and on hand in your file, the list of your leadership, and I don't know if a board of directors is required here, but I'd say get that together anyway. Have a copy on your electronic file, or the hard copy, or just a copy of your IRS letter confirming your 501c status. And then of course, having your organic documents, your EIN available, all of those things just to have kind of on hand, or as, you know, sort of a cheat sheet for you, because that is one way to start to feel like I'm making some progress towards getting this done, particularly as you embark on the sort of meaty processes of working on the narrative and then working on the budget, as we're going to go through today. So let's see. I'm looking at the other things. Okay, let's see. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, and again, I can't underscore it enough, is to, again, keep in mind what it is that why you're here, why you're looking at this application, why you're taking on this undertaking. And also to, you know, keep in mind what it is that your organization is doing and your partners for this particular funding opportunity. Thinking about also the objectives, you know, what are you looking to accomplish? Are there community goals? Are there particular partners that you're looking to engage? What are your objectives? And this is that time to, you know, have that being creative and setting those, what that's going to look like. And then of course, there's sort of that, what's the longer term goal? What's the sort of goals and the legacy that's going to, what is the groundwork and the pathway that this particular effort could be laying, whether that's looking at the planning grant in terms of considering that as a method for laying the foundation for a small or large project application, say next year, or if you're already in sort of the small and large project area. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this way is really, again, kind of essentially sort of a I don't want to say a roadmap for everybody, but this is just kind of how I have looked at and think about different grants, whether it's a grant, a $25,000 grant from the Meyer Memorial Trust, or it's a large, you know, $1 million grant from the Department of Energy, is really kind of looking at, you know, what is it that we're trying to benefit, and what is it that we're looking to do, and how are we going to utilize those funds, and how does that meet the needs of the folks that we're working with. Again, I think it was pointed out earlier in the earlier slides about eligibility. Again, one of the things that I consistently do at a certain point while I'm writing a grant is, are we eligible? And I'll start to question myself as I get into the narrative writing process. So just be clear that once you embark on this, that you are eligible, which I'm sure you all are, but just when in doubt, know that you are. So, and then again, I mentioned already, reading through the information. The other piece is really, because I think James already mentioned, we're like 5 weeks out from the actual grant submission and due date. So, you know, now is the time to take that check the checklist that's inside, I think, the documents. Hold on, you have a question. I'm going to pause.
Hold questions.
Hold questions?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So in terms of thinking of things, preparing a plan and checklist is essential, and looking at the timeline. So I think one of the really key things and critical things are these webinars really are helpful, and it's helpful when a funding agency provides these, because that is in terms something you can put in your own timeline of accomplishments towards this grant proposal, whether it's the planning grant, the small project, or the large project grant. But in terms of preparing that, sort of looking at, so this week, you know, 5 in terms of the countdown to week 1, thinking about what it is that you would like to accomplish. So, you know, you've gone through this. Next week, we're doing a narrative building component. And so there will be other things that are resources that are available to you. You know, and it's kind of, I don't have one way or the other. Some people like to start their grant preparation with the budget first and then go to the narrative. Some people like to start with the narrative and then work on the budget. So you know, it's kind of a preference. I tend to gravitate towards doing the narrative because I'm a wordsmith. That's why I went to law school, because I don't really gravitate towards numbers. But in terms of preparation for this particular webinar, it was helpful for me to take a look at the budget first, and to sort of flip the way I traditionally do this has been actually helpful in terms of me being able to help you. So again, and then thinking of that timeline. So you have your plan, but also putting some timelines in there for yourself. Like, I'd like to have a webinar done today. Next week, I'll do the narrative. And after that, you know, I'll have read through all the materials. By this date, I'll have a file of all of my organic documents and so forth. Then the next thing I would say, built into your timeline, is starting to outline once you kind of have that concept of what it is because y'all probably already know what you want to do, but you're going to start putting some content to that, particularly in response to some of the prompted questions that are already in the application itself, which I think is really helpful in terms of this particular application preparation, or at least that's the way I look at it. Is it's helpful because they're guiding. As I mentioned, sometimes with particularly federal grants, they're very general questions. And what I think is also particularly helpful with regard to this funding announcement is the scoring criteria is in there. So those are other things I think that are helpful. Go ahead and advance to the next. Okay. So the other thing also in terms of considering, you know, what it is that you're in, is also that research and gathering information, and particularly is important for the budget preparation piece. And so I'll get more into that as we get into the preceding slides. And then of course we have the drafting the narrative piece, which is a wholly separate webinar. And then of course today we have our budget conversation. And then other things to consider or think about. Some of the organizations I work with, when the grant proposal is actually done, the board of directors or the executive director or officers will want to review it and read it. So that may also be something you have to take into consideration in terms of your timeline. So just thinking about, whether that's something that needs to be done. Then of course, there's the whole process of preparation to submit, which is always sort of is a stressful time in terms of the actual time you're getting ready to submit the application. When I'm, particularly when we're looking at electronic submission, keep that in mind that if something could go wrong, something will go wrong on submission day or could go wrong. So I'm always looking to try to submit at least a day before. But believe me, I have been in that situation where we are counting down and saying we have got 2 hours until that submission button is closed. And sometimes that's just because it's just the way things happen. Board approvals come in late, partnership letters came in late. And so we're trying to, gather as much as we can so that we could submit. And so let's see. I want to stop there if we can, James, and go to questions before I go to the next stuff.
Sure, yeah. So we have 2 questions that have come in before we get into the real content here of budget development. One is, if a proposal is working with partners, is the budget solely about the requesting agency, or do you need the same information for all partners? This was Michael Human's question. You're submitting a budget that's for the entire project, including all partners that might be involved or contractors that might be providing services. So it really is a combined budget. If you're looking at the information, I'm not sure exactly which information you're talking about. If you're talking about the information of elements of the narrative, that is separate and really related to the applicant. And so maybe we'll hold part of that question for the narrative building piece, but the budget is comprehensive of both the organizational budget and what's being requested, plus other contracted services or partners that are part of the project. And second question from Greg Haar is, since funds will be distributed as a reimbursement, will loan interest payments in order to pay subcontractors be covered as part of an overhead 20% cap? Loan payments are eligible as part of overhead costs. And I think the answer would be yes. I mean, we're hoping, I think broadly, that you're not carrying a lot of interest or debt unnecessarily, and that our reimbursement processes can be pretty fast for that. But the answer, I believe, would be yes.
And James,
Ahead,
can I
Katie,
just add one thing?
Yep, please do.
And that's that, Greg, there is the option to have a partial advance. There's an option to have a partial advance rather than just a pure reimbursement. So I think we would probably want to avoid folks taking out loans to cover cash flow during the project and would opt instead for a partial advance model.
Yeah. And again, that partial advance structure would be kind of negotiated as part of the grant agreement.
Ready to go to the next slide?
Yep. All right.
Okay, so here we're going to jump into sort of the content of this, and we'll both be sort of, Sharad and I, offering our sort of experience as we roll up our sleeve and start looking at what it is that we actually need and how that aligns with the overall sort of guiding principles of the PCEF funding. And so with regard to that, that's what we're looking at. Because again, this process, you know, well, the way I look at it, sometimes you start looking at the materials and you see what the requirements and uses of funds are, and then you know what you want to do, and then you have this process of how are we matching up our effort and so forth. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, I said I'd re-emphasize, keep, what it is that you want to do in focus as you're going through these materials, the checklist, the forms and attachment. It can seem cumbersome and somewhat tedious. I just have some images here of a project that we recently did, or with one of our clients, working on a training program for tribal housing folks. And so, I just had to kind of consistently keep that. What we're working on is job training, residential solar, and energy efficiency. So as I was writing my grant, that was kind of this is what I want to accomplish. And the other thing I would say is if awarded and selected, is to document. And that was one of the main things I did, was especially, it's nice, I'm sure, for folks at PCEF to see some of the benefits of the implementation of their work. So I've learned over the years to find different and creative ways to document and for our reporting purposes. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the first questions I had when I was looking through this was trying to understand what does it mean with regard to the use of funds? Is that some sort of parameters on how we're able to utilize these funds? Are these guideposts or examples? And then if, again, because I'm an attorney, we're talking about use of funds, then I'm also thinking, on the contrary, what can we not use those funds for? And so, with regard to that, this is really sort of, as in talking with the folks at PCEF, that these are delineated within the actual guidance documents in regard to what's available and so forth, and what you can be doing with these funds. And so I just wanted to kind of list them out there as sort of in a menu option of different things. Of course, taking into consideration the overhead costs. I think that's one thing as you're starting to prepare your wish list, is not forgetting that you're going to have some hard costs, and overhead being one of those costs to kind of consistently keep out there, that you're going to have to add 20 to 25% on top of what you're already sort of the money that or the funds that you're going to use to actually do the implementation. So I saw a couple questions come up before we go on to the next slide. Do we want to answer those right now?
Why don't we go ahead and hold it just for a little bit more
Okay.
involved.
Sounds good.
Pause right after this.
Okay. So this is, go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is kind of the way that Sharad and I kind of think about as we're working on the process for preparing budgets, in terms of thinking about what we're going to need. Very similar to going on a camping trip. You don't really know what you're going to need. And when you get there, you'll realize, boy, we should have packed more of this, or we should have added that. And in terms of thinking about that, when you're putting your budget together, you're kind of taking a snapshot of today, what you think you're going to need over the next year, if we're talking about a planning grant, or longer, multi-year, if you're looking at a small or large project grant. And, I'm working with folks in terms of some of the current grants that I have, and we're like in the process of managing multiple grants, but those multi-year grants, you're also going to be doing different things in those different years. And so being sort of predicting what you're going to be doing in those multiple years. And for example, one of them, we knew we're going to taper off in year 3, that's going to primarily be our reporting and monitoring year. So we're probably not going to be using as many resources as we anticipate. And so just kind of thinking of that. And so just I wanted to briefly let Sharad talk a little bit also about his thoughts and input with regard to sort of the camping trip analogy with regard to budget planning.
Yeah, usually when I'm looking at grants, you have the people who it's a wish list and they're going camping and their budget reflects them taking an RV. And you have the others that don't look at all the costs, and it looks like they're just going out camping in the woods with just a sleeping bag and or just a blanket, right? So you really want to make sure that you cover all your costs. But when you're doing your procurement for everything, you don't want to look at the extreme high costs, and you don't want to appear to look competitive and take the extreme low costs on things, because you just don't know if prices of what you're acquiring, if they're going to go up or not. And so I usually try to just stay right in the middle of the road, or when I'm looking at grants, look at the ones that are in the middle of the road, because I know they have the best chance of accomplishing what they are with the budget they have. If a budget looks too low, it kind of throws up some red flags for me, and then I have to go through and I have to start seeing, well, can they actually get this project done with the amount that they're asking for? And if the answer is no, then we usually don't fund them, even if they're great people, right? Because they haven't considered all of those. So
I think that the key thing is looking at that, and that's where going back to one of the previous slides, talking about that research component. I think that's really critical and important. And in some of the preceding slides, I'll kind of go through a sort of sample exercise with you, but I think it's really starting to do that research, looking at bids and getting as many quotes as you can, so that you can build a budget that's well informed. You may have some partners that you've already have in mind, and you sort of have that established relationship, and that I think is something that is valuable to consider if you've got those partners. But it's also helpful just to inform you and kind of keep up with sort of what the current prices are for this particular sector. And of course, there's always those unique situations where you have a partner or a vendor or a contractor that has a unique set of skill sets that may be appropriate for your community or the folks that you work with. So those are all things I think that as I was asking the folks at PCEF, were those going to be kept in mind? And they are. So it's really, again, about that, wanting to build sort of the success and help everybody be successful in this PCEF process, and really sort of, again, going back to those guiding principles. So here's a quick check. We can go on, James, if you want to keep going.
Yep.
Okay. So this next slide. So I just wanted to kind of go through, again, kind of taking into consideration the continuum of folks that we have and their familiarity and background working on grants. I did hear some folks talking about how do you manage sort of multiple components within your grants, like sort of like sub projects within a bigger project, multiple parties that are involved, sort of, taking this over time. So what I wanted to do is sort of give you a simple way in which I start to prepare myself for preparing the budget in particular. And again, this is just one way of doing it. There's many approaches to writing grants, but this is the way in which, over time, preparing grants and preparing even the reporting process is really just a lot about information management and keeping track of the information that you have. So I referenced at the beginning a project that we were working on, which had to do with providing energy efficiency and education to tribal housing departments and authorities. And so the purpose of the project was really around helping to increase information, particularly connecting energy efficiency with tribal housing offices. The two subjects really hadn't occurred, except for maybe 2 or 3 tribes in the Pacific Northwest. And the Yakima Housing Authority in the Yakima Valley was one of those tribes that's really embraced energy efficiency applications in their housing. So they were one that we really leaned on. But there are about 60 tribes in the Pacific Northwest that weren't taking advantage of this. So our project that I'm referencing here was a training program that took place over 2 years. And the components really were to provide energy efficiency workshops to tribes in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And so the budget you're looking at here in particular was our first task in this whole overall project. And we kind of looked at each training event as a sub-component of the overall bigger project. And so this budget kind of represents, what you're looking at is how we built out this particular project budget. So I took this from the standpoint of let's break down the actual first event, because if we start melding together all that information of all 3 into one table, it becomes really confusing really quickly. And again, so this is really kind of for the purposes of keeping track and managing the information real time with the anticipation. So when I put this budget together, I was anticipating we're gonna get the grant. So, which is why I have the budget task items. So the budget items, that's my list. That's the list of things that I see that we need to accomplish our goal, which is to provide training to tribal housing folks on energy efficiency. So in order to do that, we started looking at things like, okay, we're gonna need our executive director involved in this. They are gonna need to participate somehow in the event itself. So I gotta consider their the personnel time for their participation. We had to hire a team to come and do, a contractor to come and do training on energy efficiency. Again, somebody that knows how to deliver this type of content. So we had to build that into our budget. Venue, we had to look at where are we gonna do this. Of course, in our consideration for this one was in Washington. We wanted to be close to Seattle, but we didn't want to be in Seattle. And so we got a tip from one of our folks saying, if you go to Clearwater Casino, which is in Suquamish, which is just a ferry ride away from Seattle, you're paying basically the rural GSA rate. So we were able to save some money in our budget by doing that. So we had a venue fee. What we were able to do was leverage some resources because this Suquamish tribe sponsored or paid for our venue fees. So that was something that we were able to put in our leverage table. One thing that we did have to pay for was food and catering. So had to add that into our budget. And of course, audio visual, again, one of those things you don't really think about until you start to actually implement, but that's actually a fee that we had to pay. So the AV fee, you don't want to get there and have to shout over everybody. So that, in addition to the PowerPoint and all that other stuff. Training materials were another component of that. We did some event printing. And by that I mean, we had some informational signs that we were using, kind of the stand-up version and table version. We had materials that we had to have printed, and of course, sort of the copying and supplies, like your flip charts and markers and all of that sort of thing we rolled into our training materials. Excuse me. The other thing we did, and I don't know, and that, again, this is for another funding agency, but I'm just using this as an example. We also had provided travel stipends to our participants because, again, most of these folks were coming from tribal communities who, were traveling quite a distance. So we provided $200 travel stipends per tribe, which was generally worked out to 30 stipends. And then again, adding into travel, the executive director's travel, which was, she was using her own vehicle to drive there, 1 day of per diem, which is basically, we were considering a half day of travel at the front end, and then a half day to leave, and then a full day with us on site, and we were providing all the meals, so she didn't have to pay for that. Our overall calculations for this, we were using the GSA schedule for our calculations. And so that's kind of that first, the first two, which is our, what we needed, what we need, and what we estimate that that's going to cost. The actuals I put in there is just really kind of for me. Again, I'm hopeful and optimistic that we're going to get this grant, which we did. And I put that in there for reporting purposes because this table eventually also helped me as I began working on reporting. And then in the next column, I have the project categories. So for the purposes of this training, I actually put in the categories that are under the PCEF grant. Now, granted, this is my approach to it. The PCEF folks can maybe say some of these are not in the right categories, but I interpreted things like personnel, like the executive director would be under the personnel portion of the budget. And then contracts. Let's go actually to the next slide, and then I can reference this a little bit better. So at the beginning, you saw the worksheet. This is probably for me, when I first started writing grants, was the most confusing part because you have these categories in terms of how the actual funding announcement rolls out. And then you have a lot of questions. Well, what goes into those? How do I make what I need go into these funding categories? And so that's really kind of the purpose. If we can go back to that, go back a slide. So that's how I have been over the years working, particularly when we're looking at funding announcements like this, is to start to work on that information and be able to categorize that in a way that's helpful for me to start dragging and dropping into the actual worksheet. On the side of that, I also have a project source. So like for this one, say I was applying under PCEF. That is this, I would say grant, or you could put PCEF or something, but you're asking for all of those funds. So you're asking for the executive director's hours under the PCEF grant, and the contractor training team under the PCEF grant. Venue, so say in this instance that I asked the Suquamish tribe and they said yes. So then that's one of those things where I can put in the notes, leveraged funds, who provided that, how was that procured? You know, you could also put, you know, another note in there if that was a donation, or I'm not sure how you want to do that, but it's a way to note the project funding sources. And then I have at the very bottom, other, because one of the things that we found as we were working along, which I didn't include here, we actually ended up with another sponsor, which was one of the utilities that were in the area. And so it was additionally leveraged dollars that I didn't ask for when I submitted the grant. It came in later, but it was important that I had this other there for reporting purposes down the road. Again, because I'm an optimist and figured we'd get the grant, I kind of built this particular table with that in mind. So again, go ahead and go to the next table. So as I said, I put together that sort of wish list of, not wish list, but my needs list, and then started working through that. Where I tend to like to have help is on the bottom piece. You know, what is needed by the organization and how do we build in those calculations? Now, some of you may be very good at math and can already do that on your own, but I often have to work with our bookkeeper, in some instances, the accountant or the finance office to get accurate calculations for this, because we work with multiple clients, and so some of them have different overhead and administrative or indirect cost rates. And so I often have to work with the right folks to get the right answers. So when we get down to that total project cost, that is all accurate. And especially if there's a cap on the amount you're asking for, that all the numbers make sense. So we can go to the next slide.
And maybe I'll
Okay.
well, actually, no. We'll do this slide and then we'll answer some questions.
Okay.
A brief break and then back to Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of thinking about this, again, resources for building your budget. If we're looking at, you know, a planning grant, some, you know, the small project grant or large, the complexity of that is going to vary, obviously. And so the amount of people and participants that are going to be included in the narrative, in the budget, and a part of potentially the project team are all going to be resources for building your budget. So of course, you know, like I said, the accountant, bookkeeper, finance managers are going to play a critical role in the budget, as well as, if awarded, they're going to continue to play an important role in terms of the implementation and reporting process. The other is, particularly when you're looking at projects, is the consideration of who's also involved. Are you going to need to have some input from your, if you have engineers, contractors, also vendors, your other partners, whether we're talking about your sort of a funding partner. And so just really taking advantage of some of those resources that you have. And again, it's just kind of, I don't want to make this seem like a daunting process if this is your first time. There are plenty of folks out there as resources to help you. And if those of you are pretty seasoned at this and feel comfortable, then hopefully this is just kind of information to inspire you to continue on your effort to write for the PCEF grant. But yeah, again, I was just taking a look at all this and trying to figure out how we make, again, these sort of bite-sized pieces to make the process less daunting. So that's kind of what I wanted to offer today. In terms of content presentation, James, I'm happy to continue on however you'd like to go.
Yeah, well, I think we'll take a pause to answer some of the questions that have come in through the chat, and then we can have a brief break if people need it, and then a little bit more Q&A really about how to approach grant writing and budget development, and questions either that are technical or about approach, but we're trying not to answer too many questions that are specific advice about a project. So I will look at the follow-up question first that Michael Heumann put in the chat, which is if in a planning grant, funds will be used to reimburse partners for their time participating in the planning workshops. Does that kind of expenditure need to include information about known and as of yet unknown partners? And so it seems like the question is one around stipends provided for participation in doing community engagement. And so you do not have to have identified all of your project partners. Hopefully your project scope will provide kind of the approach that you would use to identify those partners, but you don't have to have that all done. However, if you do know those partners, please do provide that information because it helps us understand and help score the project. But for the purpose of budgeting, the names of those individuals is not needed. And so you do need to identify, however, how much you would anticipate spending and how many people would be engaged in, provision of that stipend. So you do need to budget from the perspective of knowing the kind of amount of the stipend that you would anticipate providing, total number of people, and then coming up with a sum total of those. I hope that that helps. There's another question from Judith Hutchinson about land acquisition and whether building acquisition is an eligible use of funds. And so it's one of those answers that it sort of depends whether it's directly related to implementation of a project. So if there is an existing building that is being acquired and there's no improvements being made on it, then it's unlikely, then the answer is sort of no. There are some opportunities though where if a building is required, for instance, for developing a workforce and contractor training center or directly connecting to one of the grant implementation elements for a priority population, that could be an eligible expense. Additionally, and very importantly, we're, as a program, really not paying for the construction of buildings just to code or for the normal kind of business as usual requirements of a building and its shell and the things inside it. However, PCEF can be used for going above and beyond code in meeting other more deeper energy retrofit or renewable energy or kind of innovative technology goals related to that building. So I think that might actually answer a second question as well, which was whether building construction is eligible. Osmani had asked this. as part of, for example, a capital campaign to build a green building. Again, the pieces that are above and beyond code that's already required could be eligible expenses, but the construction of the building itself and the kind of sticks of it and structural elements likely would not. Going through the list here, there's a question of whether land acquisition that is property that belongs to the city of Portland could be considered for eligible for PCEF. This is probably a somewhat nuanced question. It might be related. So for land acquisition, it would need to be available for sale. And also, again, kind of a core part of a project that would be related directly to climate, to addressing climate and with a social and racial justice element. So for instance, if there were land required for regenerative agriculture or for a ground-mounted solar project, that would be then directly related to the implementation of that project. Also, there could be lease agreements too, which would be eligible costs for that. It doesn't necessarily need to be land acquisition as in direct purchase. There could be other tools for gaining access to that land that would be eligible. I don't believe it's very often that City of Portland land actually comes up for sale. So that might be a unique opportunity or question. Okay, I believe I answered the question about whether building construction is eligible. Then the next question I have here is, will there be any from Julio is, will there be any adjustment to award amounts in subsequent years? So there's maybe two pieces of that question. One is that we anticipate that the funding structure would change for future years where more grant money is available. So for instance, the definition of small and large grants being small under $200,000, large up to $1 million. The committee made that decision based on the funding amount that we have available in this round, which is at $8.6 million. We anticipate that will likely change for future rounds when we have the $40 to $60 million. The funding award, though, that if you're applying for a grant that is multi-year, we anticipate that you're budgeting for all years of that grant. And so depending on which part of that question you were asking, we also want to be clear about that if you're making a request for this funding round, that's say a small grant for $195,000 over 3 years of your anticipated project, that request should include all 3 years of that project. It's not an annual budget for that. Let's see, a question of, and in general, we will not be, oh, wait a sec. I'm looking at the order here. From George, if a project is funded, does PCEF aim to fund 100% of eligible expenses? For instance, estimating solar project will have $300,000 in eligible costs. Should there be an expectation of only 60% of the costs be funded? So we, first of all, are not requiring match or leverage as part of the grant application. There are points that are scored for them for leverage or match for large and small grants. However, there's a fairly small number of points in the overall scheme of the project, and it's not a required section of the point allocation. Also, we won't be kind of downscoping or reducing the budget request based on that amount. However, we do expect that if there's leverage or matching funds that are put into there, that those funds be acquired or secured before the project really moves forward with subsequent phases of work. And so again, we're not requiring that, but if it is in there, we do anticipate that the funds will be available before we're making large disbursements of funds. I hope that answers your your question. Oh, okay. Then a question from Kofi Desu, is land acquisition outside of Portland eligible? There I do have a very clear answer, and the answer is no. We are not allowed by the code to be investing in projects that are happening outside of the Portland city boundaries at this time. All right. So it's 5:30. We can take maybe just a 2-minute break and have an opportunity for folks to reflect a little bit on additional content or questions that they have, either really about the process and approach to writing grants, which I hope that you can direct those questions to Darrell and her team, because she does have a lot of experience in various avenues of grant writing, or clarification questions that you have about what's eligible or what's not, which we as project staff can answer. So we'll take maybe just a 2-minute break. I need to grab a glass of water, and then we'll be back at 5:35. Feel free to stretch too. I realize you've been in front of a laptop or computer for about an hour and a half now. So. All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a chance to just stretch a little bit or have some movement. And I think what we'll do so for the Q&A, either you can raise your hand or feel free to put things in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and move the slide back to the budget document, because people may have questions about kind of what goes where in that. So I'm going to go back to this and leave this up so that folks can take a look at the different categories of budgeting. Because as Darrell was sort of mentioning, there's work that happens on the side that you as an organization probably should be doing in preparing to then enter into this, that has a little bit more detail and helps you organize. But this form is effectively what will be required for the submittal. So.
And James, if I could just say one clarifying question that I had for you all is that there probably, I think the answer that I surmised that I received was around some things may not necessarily clearly fit in some of these categories. And like, for example, one of those was the land acquisition question. Where do you put that? The other was the capital for a loan program was another one I had. Where would that go? And so we talked quite a bit about the other line. And so, so I think as we kind of delve more into how do you start to put your information in there, how do you put those descriptions in there, and then how do you eventually in the next webinar, how do you connect this budget to your narrative to provide, sort of more explanation about what that means. So.
Yeah, thanks, Darrell. And and as you see this form, there's both the dollar piece and then that are related to physical improvements and construction project costs. And then we recognize that there's some projects that will have costs that are not related directly to construction, that are more things like community engagement, workforce training, and contractor development, meeting related expenses, things like that, that there's an opportunity for those two categories, and then the description of the activities in each of those categories. And so it's important to kind of be able to take a look at the things that you would like to do with your project and separate them into those different fields. So let's see, I have a couple more questions that came in. And I don't see anybody with their hand raised, but let me go through. Okay, there was a question that came in that I'm going to repaste in the, just a moment, in the chat. Okay, there's a question of, from Trin, of building a greenhouse for agricultural equipment. Will this qualify? And if so, will the installation costs qualify as well? That, in the framework of regenerative agriculture and kind of eligible types of projects, I'd say definitely yes. I think
James?
or Janet, do you want to answer in terms of the structure of a
Yeah.
greenhouse?
Yeah, so there's a couple things to think about with this one, in that I always come back to the North Star, and that is PCEF is about doing climate action that centers equity and provides triple bottom line benefit. So if your green infrastructure project is about carbon sequestration, so how do I do plantings that are going to hold on to carbon? If this is part of a training program on how to get into green agriculture, and you're saying we need the training center, and we want to go above what we could do and add solar to that. So we're wanting to do things that are going to, so then it's not really about a training grant, and it's not really about the carbon sequestration of green infrastructure. It's about, we're going to do some green job training or regenerative ag training. And in our training center, we want to reduce energy costs and the bills, and by having high energy efficiency or having solar panels or something like that. And so the costs to make the training center energy efficient, I believe would count. Katie, do you want to jump in on that?
Oh, sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Yeah, I mean, that sounds right. So I don't know that I necessarily have anything to add there. It depends on the type of the intent of the project and which of the goals of the program you're trying to achieve. Will kind of change a little bit what pieces of that installation might be considered.
Yeah, and maybe the next complicating factor would be, understanding whether or not crops grown in the greenhouse inherently may, depending on what's grown, may have greater or less carbon sequestration value than if they were, if there was not a greenhouse.
Yep.
But
And it also gets to the point that you might be applying for something that crosses buckets. So if you were saying we're going to do a regenerative ag training program, and part of my budget is going to be for teaching people about regenerative agriculture that can sequester carbon, you could write in your budget for that part of the training. And then if you also needed a facility for the training, and you had some costs that you wanted to write into the budget that were the things that let you do training or save energy on that facility, then that would go in under kind of the clean energy bucket, or anyway, it might go in a different place.
Yeah, and maybe, yeah, just a clarification that an entity can apply for, let's say, a small grant that has multiple, that touches multiple categories of, let's say, clean energy and workforce development. Those aren't separated out. And so, but what is required then is, within the documents, there's different elements that are required for the different type of grant. So both of those elements would need to be brought into the grant application. So we may have both answered and complicated your understanding of that question.
But it does speak to what you were getting at, James, in that on this budget sheet that you're filling out, you might have some things that are kind of capital related. I'm going to install this physical thing, and some things that are around, you know, the a non-physical thing. I'm going to develop a curriculum. I'm going to do outreach in my community, and that would go on that other column.
Correct. Yep. Let's see. Answering a question from George Schimbauer. If I'm using a fiscal sponsor, does the personnel budget apply to the sponsor or to my company or organization doing most of the work? If you're using a fiscal sponsor, the intent is that really fiscal sponsorship is for organizations or community groups that are not ready to apply, but that would otherwise be doing a project. It's not intended, fiscal sponsorship isn't intended primarily for companies to then implement a project. And so maybe that's one answer. The budget of the project that's applying is really what's being looked at. And so if you see in fiscal sponsorship on the budget template, there's a fee, if applicable, kind of, it's under the dark, under the black line, kind of next to the left of the yellow box. But fiscal sponsorship overhead in administration can be no more than 10% of the overall project budget. And so that is kind of a threshold or limitation. So I hope that helps answer that. There's a question from Will of, does PCEF have an estimate of the number of projects that they're seeking to fund with the $8 million? And there really is not a target number of organizations to be funded. It's all going to really depend on the applications that we receive and the kind of allocation and apportionment that the committee as a whole sees as fitting for this round of projects, informed heavily by the scoring that happens for each project. And so there isn't a target number of applicants that we have, no. Another question from George that I see is, should we insert rows under each budget topic, like equipment, and break out the costs and descriptions, or do this in a separate document? So what we don't want a lot of rows to be added to, or really any rows to be added to this budget worksheet. We hope that you can articulate those in your narrative and then the description category for in the spreadsheet. And so you can attach additional information if needed. But yeah, we're not encouraging people to add rows to this. We're hoping that people can fill out the cells and put in the description category more of that breakdown if needed. Any other colleagues want to add to that in terms of formatting?
This is Katie. Nothing about formatting. I guess I would just add that if you are awarded a grant, then you'll work with your project manager kind of to develop a slightly more detailed budget that will be used for tracking and reporting purposes. But for the purposes of scoring and evaluating, we don't need really highly granular level of detail. So just put into the description category enough information that we have a good idea that we know what you're spending money on. But it doesn't need to be sort of like super detailed, 2 hammers and 5 shovels and those sort of that level of detail.
And I'd say, and that said, as James noted, we're trying to have the format work for you. So if you feel like it doesn't work to write in a spreadsheet the tiny thing you want to say, you can have the information and upload a Word document or something else if that will help you communicate what the reviewers need to understand.
Yeah, so you can attach supplemental information. It's not required though. You could have a successful application that just fills out this sheet and provides a descriptive detail but without that, like, yeah, that granular detail as Katie mentioned. Let's see. Question from Greg of 501c3 insurance costs. Is that an other construction project cost or an overhead administrative cost? That really would be overhead administrative cost. And there are, speaking of insurance, there are insurance requirements for different types of projects. And for instance, you know, we expect all organizations to have workers' compensation insurance, and then based on the type of activity, then other insurance is required. If there's insurance that's needed above and beyond what an organization already has in order to implement a PCEF project, those insurance costs can definitely be part of a project. And then if it's more general insurance that, let's say, every 501c3 organization should have, regardless of the type of activities that they do, then those can be just included as overhead, as part of the bundled overhead costs. And I hope that helps clarify. So yeah, we have about 12 minutes left. If people have questions, feel free to either raise your hand and you can ask them directly, or I guess I would turn it back over to Darrell if you have additional tips or kind of ways to have people approach the budget development piece that you want to share. This is a good opportunity to kind of bring us home. So.
Thank you, James. No, I appreciate this. It's been interesting. I anticipated sort of the spirit of a lot of the questions that were going to come up, is that the more information folks were receiving in this process, or even just kind of me walking through the way in which I approach the budget writing process, it does start to generate more questions. I know we got a lot of very specific questions about, sort of what types of components are eligible and certain requirements, and then how do you put that information into this particular budget worksheet. But I do want to ensure that if folks, that are embarking on the process of, this is the first time you're going to be writing a grant, that, again, I encourage you to find those resources. Of course, this is one resource. It will be available as a recorded webinar in terms of helping answer that. And I guess want to speak particularly to those folks that are new to the grant writing process, that this is probably one of those great opportunities, I think, for folks to do, because this one, I think you all on the PCEF side have really made very accessible in terms of folks in the community's ability to respond to this particular funding opportunity. There's a lot of information out there that I think is helpful. And I just want to thank you guys and applaud you all in terms of this sort of inaugural funding opportunity, in terms of rolling this out, as well as, being able to take sort of a sample, person or folks such as us at Kaneem Associates to be able to help our fellow folks in the community sort of walk through the budget development process for this particular opportunity. So that's, I guess, in terms of my parting thoughts, just to encourage everybody. And yeah, this is exciting, particularly as a citizen of the city of Portland.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Darrell. Yeah, and just in the chat, my colleague Janet had noted it, but just want to also highlight that we will have a session on narrative building, which will dive a little bit deeper into the elements that are required in the application of kind of writing your story, connecting your project to what you want to do, and who your organization serves. A lot of that kind of foundational narrative piece that will be happening next Thursday from noon to 2, and then we'll have another budget development training. Again, the content will be pretty much exactly the same as this, so you do not need to attend that. And then we'll have another grant narrative writing training. Again, the content will be the same as the first grant narrative writing training. On Monday the 19th, we'll be posting that on our calendar. but there is a resource available to all nonprofits through the Nonprofit Association of Oregon, which has a lot of resources, and they've been made, especially during COVID, they've made all their resources free and their trainings free for the rest of the year. And so we encourage you, if you're interested, to look at their resources as well, because they provide a lot of both application type resources as well as administrative and ways to think about successfully implementing grants. So yeah, I'll also note maybe just one follow-up quickly to the question of the number of grants that we anticipate awarding, because there's a little bit of nuance there, which is for planning grants. Those can be for up to $100,000, and the committee has allocated a minimum of $1.5 million for that type of planning grant. And so, again, we don't know how many people will apply, what the award amounts are that people are seeking, but that is, I guess, the only place where there's some threshold of like, we will fund at least 15 of those planning grants. If everybody applies for $100,000, we'd be able to fund many more if people have smaller requests.
Hey, James, Janet here. Two things else to share. I think on that question of on your budget, if you sit down and you think, what's the thing I want to do, and you're going to have to come up with the sort of the steps and the milestones, like what's it going to take for me to actually do that thing, and what are each of those going to cost, is just, that's a really great place to start. And then thinking about, and do I have the right partner, and do I need to check with them? And just remember, it is an iterative process often. You had one partner in mind, but then they changed their mind, and then you went to another one, or you don't have the partner, so you're guessing. But if you're clear of what it takes to do the thing you want to do, then you can start building out what those costs would be. And the other thing that you might discover is, maybe I'm not quite ready to actually do the thing. I still need to do some more of the planning part of it, and the planning grant is what makes sense. And the other thing, again, I like to emphasize, this isn't a one-shot deal. We have a certain amount of money here for year one, and then we'll have a larger amount of money and on a continuing basis. So don't feel this pressure like, if I don't get an application in November 16th, I'll never have this opportunity again. This is, the first, hopefully, of many to come.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Yeah, that is really important, that people don't feel necessarily rushed to apply in this round. And we'll have more resources available in future rounds. And we'll also be developing more capacity building trainings and opportunities to grow as an organization. And so look for those in future rounds in 2021 as well. This is some of the links that we have to the PCEF grant writing and technical assistance. Also, if you do have questions, we have both the phone line and the email inbox to take questions. And what we're doing is every Wednesday, we're kind of gathering the questions we've gotten from the previous week and providing an updated rolling FAQ on our website. And so if there were things that you're wondering, many other people probably have too. And so as we close, we do have a kind of exit poll for you as well. So don't leave quite yet. But we do want to know whether this has been helpful, and kind of also how likely you are to apply in this round. Oh, I do see one more question though from Julio, who raises his hand. So
it's not so much a question as much as a comment. As somebody who voted for this and has been watching this process grow, and now involved in the process, you all have done such an amazing job. And I want to say thank you for the opportunity that you all are giving people in Portland to make this happen and to change our world. So yeah, fabulous. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot to us too. And yeah, we appreciate that feedback. So yeah, we'll let you go here in a moment, but we're going to launch this next poll here. And just, I won't share the results though, so feel free to answer completely honestly here what you're thinking about in terms of whether this was helpful, and then also how likely you are to submit an application, whether you feel like you're getting ready or whether you're going to wait it out and take some more time. All right, and so I think most everybody voted there. And so, yeah, thank you all for your responses. And we're going to hang out here for just a couple more minutes if anything else does come up that you have questions on, just so that we can make sure we're here till 6. But feel free. We're really grateful that you spend this couple hours with us, and we hope it has been helpful. And yeah, feel free to engage in the other opportunities we have for learning as well. And have a great evening. And thank you all for being here. I do see one question from George, but yeah, we can still take questions. We have a couple minutes left.
Hey there. Yeah, I had just maybe a clarification on how the fiscal sponsorship works. So for my project, we're doing a low-income housing tax credit project, and I'm an independent developer who will be entering a limited partnership with the tax credit investors and our resident services group, who is a nonprofit. And that will be the property owner and operator for the long term. It's that limited partnership. And so I was thinking that our nonprofit partner could be our fiscal sponsor to bring solar into the project and the sustainable program services associated with that. Does that sound like something that would work?
Well, first of all, we can't provide guidance on any particular project, so I have to be a little bit careful there. But
okay,
the intent is for the nonprofit organizations to identify projects that are meeting their goals and to apply for those, potentially in partnership with private businesses or other organizations. Mm-hmm. Really, the intent is it be led by a nonprofit organization. And so I guess that would be our overall guidance in terms of the approach and the values of Portland Clean Energy Fund.
Okay.
And George, this is Janet here. If you hadn't seen the PCEF legislation, that's also, there's a link on our website. And I would find that helpful to go back to the legislative intent. And so the legislation is PCEF grants go to nonprofit organizations. Mm-hmm. Those, the communities closest to the issues and understanding, how to respond to community needs and interests and opportunities. And understanding that sometimes people are doing the work and they hadn't incorporated as a nonprofit, but, and then, so their committee has created the space around fiscal sponsorship, because in case you're not yet incorporated, or maybe you're incorporated, but you're just really small and don't have the administrative capacity. And so it's just easier to have another organization whose mission you align with. And in the guidance document, if you there's a section that talks about fiscal sponsorship and and that match. And anybody who's serving the role as a fiscal sponsor has that legal obligation. And Darrell can probably speak to this better than I can. But you take that role if it aligns with your organization's mission. Otherwise, you can lose your nonprofit status. So those are just a couple things to think about as far as who's serving as a fiscal sponsor, and if it and when and how you can have that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Occur.
Yeah, I just read that form, and I think I just need to learn a little bit more. But they will be involved, on every day at the property, because they'll be the manager and resident services provider, and they're newer into the sustainability space. So I'm kind of trying to help them get into it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of why I'm here, and trying to learn more so that we can work on it together by the time the project's done.
Yeah, and nonprofits can can apply with partners already identified that they want to work with. That is allowed. And, you know, but really it is the nonprofit organization that would receive funds, and it would be broadly, like, there's a difference between a partnership between a nonprofit and another organization and fiscal sponsorship, which is really intended to help organizations that otherwise could apply but don't have the capacity to apply themselves at that point. So
Yeah, but if I could just interject, and I mean, obviously, Greg or George, sorry.
Yeah, I was understanding that incorrectly.
Yeah.
I think, and we don't know all the ins and outs of your particular project and wouldn't necessarily want to comment on them if anyway, but I will say that, I mean, if there was a nonprofit organization that was providing services in an affordable housing development, I could imagine them just applying for funds to put solar panels on that development, whether or not they owned the building. I mean, if they would obviously have to do it in coordination with the owner, but that would be kind of another thing that I could imagine happening.
Okay.
It'll be common, if not the majority of the time, that a nonprofit is partnering with someone in the private sector who's the contractor. Like if I'm a faith-based, you know, my church or my mosque or my synagogue wants to install solar, I'm a nonprofit who's applying, and then there's someone that I work with to be helping me maybe figure out the budget and be installing it. But it's the nonprofit who's the one determining that that's the community need. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's just a different structure, and at the end of the day, it's the same goal. So I think we can make it work. Okay, well, thank you guys.
yeah, thank you for your question. And I think we are a little over time, so.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, oh, no, it's okay. It was a good question.
Yeah, have a good night.
Thanks all, have a good night.
Great.
Take care.
Bye.
Cheers. Tanya is still on.